Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar presentation titled How Businesses Can Boost Revenue from Inbound Sales Calls. Today, we'll be talking about our proven three-step optimization process that organizations can take to really understand the value of phone calls and specifically find more value in inbound phone calls that they may be missing from their organization. Before we get started with introducing today's presenters and actually getting into today's topic, I do have just a few housekeeping items for you to make note of as an attendee. The first housekeeping item for today is that we will have time for questions at the end of today's presentation. And if you would like to ask a question, you can do so through the questions section of your GoToWebinar panel on your screen. So what that means, in case you're a little new to GoToWebinar, is there is one window where you can see today's presentation slides, and there is another floating window on your computer screen where you can go and change your audio options if you want to switch between a headset or a phone for listening to today's presentation. Within that section, there's an additional section that's titled Questions, and that is where you can go to submit any questions that you have for either myself, if you're having technical difficulties, or anything related to today's presentation or relating to something our presenters speak on. Please note that you're more than welcome to submit questions throughout today's presentation if something comes up and you're curious about it and you want to learn more, but you won't be having an answer to that question until the end of today's presentation when we actually answer questions with our presenters. That being said, today's presentation is also being recorded, so if you'd like to go back and watch a recording of this, you can do so tomorrow. You'll actually be getting additional information on that via email tomorrow. But let's go ahead and get started and introduce today's presenters. Today's presenters are Brian Del Monte and Sterling Weiss. Our first presenter is actually going to be Sterling Weiss. He's a Senior Business Development Manager here at Marchex, and he has a lot of great experience and understanding of ways that organizations use phone calls and kind of get more revenue and get more insights from the phone calls that they're generating at their business. And then our second presenter today, Brian Del Monte, he's the president of the Aviation Agency. And some of you may be familiar with him, some of you may be colleagues with him since he probably invited you, but he's going to be speaking about ways that he has seen the value of phone calls really impacting his industry within the aviation industry. And Sterling will be kind of more broadly talking about things across industries. So we'll be giving you a breakdown for the aviation industry, but also really giving you some insight on why phone calls are important for every industry. On this next slide, you'll see that we have an agenda for today's presentation. So like I mentioned, we'll be talking about why calls are important to kind of start us off. We'll be talking about ways that you can optimize phone calls, ways that you can really improve the quantity, the quality, or just generally the conversations of phone calls that are coming into your wrap up today's presentation with a summary of key takeaways. So we'll make sure that we reiterate the main points that we're making throughout today's presentation and remind you at the end. And then we will follow up with an end of today's presentation with time for questions. So without further ado, it's time for me to pass things over to Brian, who will formally introduce himself since he is today's guest speaker. So Brian, thank you for joining us today and thank you for presenting.
Thanks, Cullen, and I really want to thank Marchex for putting this together with me. For those who might not know me, my name is Brian Del Monte. I'm the president of the Aviation Agency, which is an advertising agency that focuses exclusively on the industry of aviation and aerospace. Before founding this agency, I've worked with some of the largest brands in the world like Marriott, Hilton, Medtronic, and others. It was actually in hospitality that I first started working with our host, Marchex, about 10 years ago. What you're going to see today is a presentation on inbound call strategies. I asked Marchex to put this together, and they graciously agreed because I feel this industry needs greater exposure to marketing strategy and technologies. In many respects, the aviation aerospace industry is years behind where other industries are in terms of marketing. And my hope with today's training is you'll be exposed to the idea of call analytics. You'll gain some insights from what Marchex has learned with other clients in other industries. And these things are going to help you learn today how to immediately put tactics and activities to work, making the phone make you more money. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Sterling, who's going to be doing most of the presentation today. Sterling.
Well, Brian, thank you very much. Cullen, thank you as well. Thank you everyone who's attending today. Very grateful to have you along, and hopefully we provide you some basic kind of foundational tactics and best practices around how to optimize calls that are coming into your business. Many of you probably have not heard of Marchex, frankly. In other industries that highly value phone calls, drive significant parts of their revenue. Through inbound calls, we've got significant traction. But Marchex really is the leader in conversation analytics. So if you think in terms of, you're seeing more and more of this technology, frankly, in your daily lives. So whether you have an Amazon Alexa device or you're just barking a command into your iPhone and telling Siri to point me to the nearest pizza joint, you get a sense for what this technology looks like. But instead of processing a simple command and responding with some back-end analytics, AI that's pushing a response your way, we're processing two-way conversations, much more complicated process. So think in terms of industries like automotive and financial services. Brian mentioned travel a bit ago, real estate, healthcare. These are industries that really the lifeblood is the inbound phone call. And there are these moments of truth that these brands or these industries want to get right in delivering not only optimized revenue opportunities, but a killer customer experience. So hopefully that gives you a quick overview of who we are, what we do, and kind of how we do it.
Thanks, Sterling. I want to set the table today for the people that I've invited, the aviation group, and I know there are others on the call. And I promise I'm just going to let Sterling get to the good stuff in a moment here. I want to expand a little bit about why I think this is important for aviation and aerospace. I met with Marchex again about 2 months ago, and they showed me what they've been up to. And it was that discussion that led to today's webinar, because the insights you're going to hear today are going to help you make more money with essentially the incoming stream you already have. And I know I've harped on this before. Anybody who talks to me knows I harp on this stat. 83% of the leads that companies generate, not just aviation or aerospace, but across the entire industry of commerce, 83% of the leads that they generate never go anywhere. And that's insane in my view. Now, I know lots of you focus on your leaky bucket in your funnel, right? Where am I losing leads? Where am I losing sales? Most of you are focused on conversion. Conversion is indeed very important, but I doubt that many of you think about the top of the funnel activities and the leakiness there. And for most of you, your entire sales process begins with a phone call. Either people calling you who need something, or people who call you back after you've initially contacted them. And so inbound calls are indeed a contributor to that leaky top of funnel activity. And the case studies today that Sterling's going to present are going to demonstrate this rather clearly. But I want you to keep in mind the big picture to apply it to your organization. Namely, 1, reducing the calls that never get answered. 2, having better calls when your people, or you, are interacting with prospects and customers. And 3, converting people on the phone, whether that's a sale or a next step or a meeting. I can't tell you the number of times I've seen that problem, especially in industries that rely heavily, like aviation does, on the phone, where they don't ask for the next step or they don't build the relationship. And so, Sterling, show us what Marchex learned about why calls matter.
Yeah, Brian, happy to do that. So let's take a look at how we're going to frame this conversation today. When you think of the inbound call, there are 3 different components. There's the quantity, the quality, and the conversation. And we just want to talk to the quantity. How do we make this process, this journey seamless? The quality around, again, enabling the sales channel to engage these people, get to the point of the meat to why they're calling, and then offer a solution so the customer gets what they want. You drive revenue, and they have a great experience. So, but let's first take a look at why calls matter. it's interesting because a lot of marketers today kind of disregard phone calls, and which is interesting. It's not unusual. I mean, we live in this highly digital age. Your customers are engaging you across different touch points, especially online, through different devices and platforms. But believe it or not, there's a lot of research that shows that the good old phone call is a super productive weapon for driving revenue. For example, this data here we're showing regarding a survey or research that Forrester had done showed that consumers or customers who call spend 28% more money. They convert faster, meaning the sales cycle itself is shorter by 30%. But the callers themselves are better customers. They have a longer shelf life. They churn less, in fact, 28% less. So hopefully this gives you a sense for how important phone calls are as a means for driving revenue, regardless of your industry. So guys, let's take a look. I mentioned the first phase of the phone call that we're going to take a look at is the quantity piece. So when you think of, it's baseball season, I can't help but use a sports analogy here, but think of the inbound calls and at-bat. And every at-bat or inbound call is this at-bat where you have an opportunity to shine, to knock it out of the park, or frankly, swing and miss. And what we know is the goal here is to provide a seamless customer experience. So you think of the customer's journey, the first thing they do is they pick up the phone and give you a call because they have a problem they're looking to solve. You want to enable a perfectly seamless process by which the customer dials the number and speaks to someone on the other end of the line who's capable of solving the problem. The problem is there's often breakage in this journey. And the first step in enabling this, optimizing of inbound calls piece is eliminating that breakage. So what we want to look at here is failed calls can represent any number of things, and they're usually mechanical in nature, meaning the customer calls and the first thing they're prompted to do is, select a prompt in an IVR, select 1 for sales, 2 for customer service, 3 for financing. They've got to go through this wonderland of trying to figure out where they want to go. Sometimes they speak to someone and that person will transfer them to whatever appropriate department. That's great because it's a human interaction, but still we're bouncing them around. There's opportunities to lose the call. Sometimes people are put on hold for too long, and they just frankly don't care to leave a message and just bounce and go call a competitor. So the goal again is let's focus in this case in eliminating the breakage in that customer path to purchase. And for example, we know that if you can answer the phone within 4 rings, you're going to be exponentially more successful in delivering revenue and value to the customer than after 4 rings. So let's talk about specific tactics a little bit, if we can. So one thing we want to do is we talk about this quantity piece as well, optimizing these at-bats is get the caller to the right place quickly. Again, make it seamless, quick and seamless, make it easy. Have a human answer each call. And, in this day and age of automation and minimizing headcount and, operational efficiencies and all that good stuff, there is a ton of data that supports that that when a business interacts with a human versus a machine, the revenue opportunities and the customer experience go up exponentially. And in the instance where someone is having to leave a message, it's super easy to have the customer prompted to drop a voicemail in the machine. That's often abandoned, a point of breakage. So if you can, have someone within the organization, whether they're in a sales or support capacity, take that message. It just really sends a strong message to the customer that we're interested in working with you, we're interested in solving your problem, we care.
If I could jump in for a second, I want to share some observations for the aviation aerospace industry. One of the things I've noticed is the bigger the company gets, the less likely I am to talk to someone ever if initially, okay? And so I always got a sense of like how big they must be by how much automation there is.
Mhm.
And I want people to be sensitive to that, because one of the stats on this slide, 60% of calls to sales departments show purchase intent. Honestly, for this industry, I understand Marchex works with, like, as I've been telling you, all different types of industries. For aerospace and aviation, nobody calls you to ask you what the weather is. Nobody calls for a social call, and they're generally not calling just to get information. So that number is closer to 90%. And I will tell you that the companies that focus on customer intimacy, regardless of how big they are, do better than the ones that focus on, I guess, what I would call like prospect efficiency, just processing people that come through the door as quickly as possible. And so things like having a human take the message does matter in terms of how well that company does. The companies that I look at and talk to, they may not have the biggest revenue, but the guys who take home the best amount of their revenue, the guys who keep their strongest prices and hold the line, they focus on customer intimacy. And so getting to the right person, talking to someone, not being treated like a number matters a lot to this industry.
Good stuff, Brian. Appreciate that. So guys, so let's take a quick look at what this actually looks like. You know, this opportunity to make the customer journey more seamless. And this effort to optimize inbound phone calls, this initial piece is the low-hanging fruit. So let me give you a quick sense for what this looks like in the real world. Marchex works with a major automotive manufacturer, Detroit-based. They have over 4,000 dealerships throughout North America. Their marketing team came to us with this idea that they wanted to get their head around what it really looked like to be a customer that called one of their stores. And you know, you own a car, you either bought it or you get it serviced, and you probably get a sense for what their goal is here, having experienced it firsthand. But their goal was, yeah, we have all these disparate locations. They're independent franchises, you know, so we don't get a lot of insight into what this caller or customer experience looks like. So they came to us to help in that effort, and they learned some really shocking things. So the goal, first of all, hey, why are callers calling, and then what does that experience look like, and then what can we control? How can we deliver a better customer experience, and in that process, hopefully drive more revenue? So the solution was this program they defined as Fix the Phones. So they wanted to implement, you know, call tracking, call analytics technology, so they could automate this entire process. They wanted to learn where the opportunities were, where they were dropping the ball organizationally. And again, getting back to that quantity piece I mentioned a moment ago. And then what action could they take based on the data that they were gleaning to fix this process? So what they learned was there were all kinds of points of breakage, and really varied depending on the business model. If it was one where a larger dealer group, for example, many of them have call center environments where there's a lot of breakage in how, you know, different reps within that call center environment handled calls or callers. In the individual store locations where there's handler would transfer someone to a sales department, and that person would sit on hold forever, and they'd finally say, forget it. By taking these different insights, they were over, I want to say it was a 9-month, 12-month period. I mean, they started seeing benefits and results almost immediately. They were able to reduce their failed call rate from 15% to 7%. You know, pretty significant moving of the needle, just by understanding where the breakage was in that customer path to purchase. But the average transaction in the automotive dealer space is about $400. And by just addressing this low-hanging fruit, they were able to impact their dealer network by about $150 million.
I mean, that's an amazing case study. And I realize that for some people in my industry, that may be tough to fathom it all in. But again, I mean, focusing on the $400 average ticket, They have a huge network, but there's a few things I'd want to point out here. One is they didn't increase the number of incoming calls. They just answered more of them properly. And they had this huge swing from a minor change, realistically, in the number of at-bats that they were getting, but they were connecting way more. For most of the people I talked to, what would this mean? Well, anywhere between 1 to 5 more sales a quarter. And for many of you, that means a significant change in revenue. So, I realize it's easy to get sucked in by the numbers, but this works whether you're big or small.
Beautiful, Brian. Yeah, I appreciate that industry insight. So now let's take a look at the quality piece. Kind of, what can we control from an internal headcount standpoint to ensure that our reps are doing the right things and in engaging these customers. So let's take a look at some best practices around that. How we might be able to influence you in the area of optimizing the sales team. So the goal here with this quality piece is, we strongly recommend in this effort to improve the inbound caller experience and optimize revenue and the customer experience, it's really helpful to have some tools in place to measure where you are currently. So one thing we talk about oftentimes is, when we're talking with a large automotive brand or a healthcare provider or whatever the case, a hotel brand, what have you, oftentimes they don't know where they are currently. What is my current state? So the goal here is you got to understand and identify where you are currently, establish a baseline so we can set up goals and objectives for achieving performance metrics moving forward. So the first step here is, hey, how do we measure performance? What's our current state? And then uncover opportunity, leverage that data to uncover opportunities for training. One thing we find there's a lot of value in getting buy-in based on data. The data says we're not even starting every call with a warm greeting. So let's start there with our greeting and how we initiate a conversation with our customers. And then design the scripts so you're delivering on the things you want to get done and get accomplished. So the goal here with the quality piece is let's focus on the sales team.
I think that's important, especially for larger aerospace companies where you're going to have salesmen. Some of you that I invited to the call manage, incoming teams, whether it's B2C or B2B, and you have guys that are good, and you have guys that maybe aren't so good. One of the things that this does, right? And let's face it, I mean, everybody has differing abilities. But, one of the things we're going to get into a little bit here is, well, why is the one guy mediocre and the other guy better? A lot of it has to do with what the quality of the call is like. And so being able to measure that, that's one of the things Marchex does, being able to measure what's going on in that call, you essentially can train up your weaker performing individuals.
Excellent. So let's take a look at what that looks like again from a real world context. We have a client that's the fastest growing moving services franchise company, 2 men in a truck. I absolutely adore these guys. And the reason largely is this is a very blue collar industry, a very blue collar brand. But when they first came to us, the thing that intrigued me about their mission was they want to be the standard bearer for delivering a killer customer experience. They actually use the term Nordstrom. We want to be like Nordstrom in that respect. And I'm thinking, wow, that's a reach. I've used moving companies before. Nordstrom's is definitely not the brand that immediately comes to mind when I'm thinking about the experience I had with moving companies. Well, these guys are on a mission to do that. They have a couple of key challenges though. One, their business is absolutely dependent on inbound phone calls, unquestionably. One of the challenges, though, is their 300 plus locations are all franchise locations. So again, there's this additional layer of losing insight into that customer experience. They have no idea how these 300 plus locations in local markets are engaging with customers. And the VP of marketing at the time mentioned here, Caleb, he told me that he felt like they were individual rogue nations, and he felt that they were just doing and saying whatever, and it wasn't in alignment with what the brand they were trying to build. So what they wanted to do is, again, optimize these inbound calls, get their head around what was currently happening so they could establish a baseline, understand where they were. But then the next piece was, and it's interesting, Brian, you mentioned this a moment ago, we want to know what our best franchisees are doing and saying to drive a killer customer experience and drive higher conversion rates of, say, estimates to actual jobs, that kind of thing. And then once we know that, we can scale these learnings across the organization. Marchex can help with that. So what they learned is once we implemented this program, were a number of operational improvements. They were able to improve, the customer experience, make it more seamless. What they found was a ton of the highest percent of calls that were failing were just, the staff was out in the field conducting a move, so people were being asked to leave a message. Well, the average move was over $800. That's the average move value or transaction value. But on top of that, they have additional services they offer that can easily double the cost of a move, double their revenue. And what they found was their best performing franchisees were asking simple questions like, hey, do you need help packing your stuff? Well, more often than not, the customer didn't even know they offered that. But by simply asking some of these key questions, these franchises that were successful were literally doubling their revenue versus the lower performing ones. So anyway, the goal again was, hey, let's gain insights into how we're engaging these customers so we can then take what we learn and scale the best practices across the entire organization and improve the sales channel's performance overall. So hopefully that gives you a sense for how you can leverage, insights into the sales channel's performance itself to improve the quality piece. So let's talk about the conversation itself. What are some of the tactics we can employ starting today to guide improvement with how we handle conversations, how we structure them? So a couple things to think about here as you talk and as you think about how we're literally engaging these customers that call. A couple key things to think about. One, it's a good practice to think about the 3 stages or the 3 segments of the call and employ tactics around each of them. One thing I want to stress, and it's going to sound silly because in industries perhaps like aviation, I know in automotive, for example, and others, there's this term we use called active listening. Many of you may not have heard of what that is, but I'll explain what that means here in a second. So the goal here is to break the call down into 3 stages. Think of the first phase of the call, the early part. One thing we have learned through processing millions of calls across our platform, across various industries, is there's this concept of a warm greeting that outperforms a more typical scripted greeting. So I'll give you a sense for what that looks like. So one of our key clients is the fastest growing wireless provider here based in Seattle. And they had, at the time they came to us, 3 call centers. And their CEO, who's today looked at as a rock star in the wireless space, came to us and he wanted to know how he felt in this age of automation. All our competitors are looking to automate the sales process. You want a wireless plan, you go to the website, you select a plan, it's all automated, you enter a credit card, bing, bang, boom. He felt by making the process more personable, they were going to win. And today, he proved them right. So what he wanted to learn was, what are our best agents doing to drive higher engagement and better customer experience. And one learning they learned immediately within 90 days of implementing some of this technology was their best reps were starting with a warm greeting. And basically their best reps were starting a conversation. Typical conversation would be, hey, this is Sterling with brand X. Thanks for calling, how can I help you? Their best performers, however, were starting the conversation like this. Hey, this is Sterling with brand X. Thanks for calling today. Hey man, how's your day going today? That simple, subtle difference they identified as a warm greeting was driving double-digit revenue growth and conversion rates, and higher rated, and they were finding the reps were actually being mentioned by name in customer surveys. So by starting the conversation, be polite with a warm greeting. Tons of data supports that by being more warmer in that context, you're going to drive higher conversion rates and higher revenue. If you look at the mid-call, the goal here is to establish why the caller's calling. What's the need? And the goal here again is use these active listening techniques to be empathetic. So what that means is you want to understand why the caller's calling so you can solve the problem as quickly as possible. By being empathetic, what I mean is show that you're listening. And you can do that by using simple phrases like, oh my gosh, you sound like this is an urgent situation, or I hear your pain. Just really put that exclamation mark on how effectively you understand their pain point and how you're going to solve it. And then at the end of the call, understand you're going to be prescriptive here. You're the expert. And describe to the customer, repeat back to them if you have to what your understanding of the problem is and how you're going to solve it. Here's what we'll do. What I recommend is, or here's how we're going to solve your problem. So repeat back next steps or whatever action you're going to take. And then lastly, ask for the darn order. Provide your contact info in the event they need to call you back, and always thank them for calling. So the goal here is by utilizing active listening techniques, you're showing empathy, you're showing the customer you care and that you're actually tuned into their problem and interested in solving it.
I would argue for aviation, the thing to remember is WIFM. What's in it for me, right? Be friendly, be oriented towards the caller, have a conversational appeal, and especially, hey, I mean, guys, especially those of you that are in sales, that I talk to all the time, it's all relationship based. We talk about B2C and B2B, but in the end, a person makes the purchase decision, whether it's, a consumer purchase or a business purchase. I mean, and so I think Sterling, what your data shows is be helpful, be personable, be friendly, and try to solve the problem. Is that fair?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's remarkable how being warm and fuzzy, for silly as that sounds, how effective that can be. Because we have an expectation, we call someone on the phone, especially in a call center environment, of this is going to be highly scripted, highly robotized, robotic, whatever. It's going to be completely void of emotion or feeling. For those who, contrast that experience or that expectation, they're going to win huge.
Well, I think, again, for aviation, Southwest Airlines has done pretty well actually treating its customers as people. Wouldn't you agree?
Agreed. I think Alaska immediately comes to mind as well.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. They're both very good at that. Well, I want to thank Sterling and Cullen, and the entire team at Marchex. This has been a great seminar. I know we're coming up against our timeline here. I know that, for some of you, this may be a fire hose of information. So I wanted to distill down for you guys some key takeaways. I'm going to show you some things that Marchex can do in a moment. But one, I want people to start thinking about every incoming call as a sale. You saw 2 case studies where how they changed how they answered the phone increased their revenues. They didn't advertise more. They didn't need to get more at-bats. All they needed to do was handle the pitches coming to them more effectively. So every time that phone rings, treat them as orders, not just calls. And I will tell you that as I call on businesses in this space, it's very erratic how people handle an incoming call. Okay. Second thing is, the caller experience matters. Human interaction, solutions that are focused on the customer. Now, I know for some of you that are larger, you've got IVRs, the whole press 1 for this, press 2 for this. If there's any way for you to circumvent that to a certain extent, I will tell you, I've dealt, in dealing with companies that are very large, like GE and Honeywell and Boeing, being able to break out a division and have it go its own way in terms to within brand, cohesion, but being able to somewhat break out from underneath the enterprise so that the customer can find them quicker leads to a big change in the outcomes. And so similarly for you as salespeople that are taking in inbound calls or business directors taking in inbound calls, if they don't have to go through the IVR again to reach you, that's better than not. Okay. The third thing is, empathy and listening. All you've heard from Sterling and the case studies is care. And what does it really cost for you to care? Not much, especially if you remember one, which is the guy on the other side of the line is probably looking for reasons to buy from you. That's why they called. So if you care and you build that relationship, and let's face it, in this industry, it's always about relationship. Most customers aren't going to know exactly what they want. So tease it out of them, be friendly, focus on that mid-call, but, be empathetic and care about their issue. Fourth, have a point. I can't tell you how many I talk to where you don't communicate what matters to the caller. Okay. You don't care enough about the underlying solution, and you've got your, well, so-and-so's not here. I can't tell you how many businesses I'll call somebody and I'll say, hey, I want to speak to so-and-so. Well, he's not here. And never actually try to figure out what it is I need or if anybody else can help me. Okay. So when you're communicating to the caller, try to give them something that matters most to them and not so much that matters most to you. And finally, again, I know it sounds dumb, actually ask for a resolution. Maybe that's a sale, maybe that's a commitment, that's a clear next step. You have a prescription, but do it on each and every call. Because again, the case studies that you've seen today, and again, Marchex, Sterling said they've processed 1 billion minutes. That's 1,900 years worth of phone calls. And so one of the key things to tease out of that was actually ask for the sale. And so I can't stress that enough. If, just changing how you answer the phone, asking for the sale for their one client increased revenue $150 million. For 2 men in a truck, change their game. Same thing can happen for you. And so for me, when I went through and I saw the technology and we were putting this presentation together, these were the things that I think are most important to this industry. But Sterling, any last thoughts?
No, I think you nailed it, Brian. Yeah, there are some real simple tactics you can employ today by gaining insight into where this customer breakage, the breakage is in that customer path to purchase. That's the low-hanging fruit. You'll see immediate results there. The next step would then be to focus on the sales org itself. How do we understand what our best reps are doing and saying to drive a better customer experience, higher conversion rates, more revenue, whatever metric you're interested in, and then scale those learnings across the org. And then lastly is the idea of, hey, let's focus on closing more business, driving more at-bats by optimizing media, that kind of thing.
All right, thank you both. It's now time for some questions. The first question that we have is, what phrases or words do you recommend agents use on phone calls?
Words or phrases? Good question. I'm going to go back to what I mentioned earlier in the conversation piece, thinking in terms of the quality aspect. Be empathetic. And I know my gut tells me within the aviation space, I'm going to look at the automotive industry as kind of a comparison. particularly if I'm ordering parts. My dad, I grew up in a household, my dad owned his own German car repair business. So he had to take time out of his day to order parts from parts suppliers. And it was a very blue collar thing. My macho dad calling the parts depot or whatever to get parts delivered. Not a lot of warm and fuzzy conversation going on. But to Brian's point earlier, take that opportunity, that at bat, to be empathetic. To show through your words that you're listening and that you care. And those, again, can be words like, here's what we'll do to solve the problem. Hey, Mr. Weiss, I understand your need to get these parts in immediately. We're going to be prescriptive in solving that for you. So again, don't be afraid to show your warm and fuzzy side, I guess, in being empathetic. It's just remarkable how effective that using those kind of words and phrases can be in establishing a relationship.
All right, thank you very much. The last question that we have is, how much of what you talk about could be applied to cold calling or inbound activities?
Well, I think with regard to cold calling, I think what we find so much in so many outbound environments is, we have a script, and oftentimes that script is kind of canned, again, robotic. I could speak to, again, making it unique to the caller, to your target, whoever you're calling. Do some research and understand, make some perceptions around what you think their pain points might be. Learn something about their business. So whatever initial messaging you have for them is tailored to them and what you believe their needs are based on your experience in serving others like them.
Well, and one thing as a guy, if I could just jump in, as a guy
Sure.
who makes a lot of cold calls, just because you called them doesn't mean everything you've learned today goes out the window. You still want to be friendly. You still want to have empathy. Yeah, you have a script going in, but let's face it, as a guy who was with the Pentagon for a long time, no plan survives contact with the enemy. Things change as soon as they agree to listen to you. Right. So, part of what I would say applies is this. The stages of the phone call that Sterling presented are true whether it's inbound versus outbound. Okay. Now, granted, it's a little bit stronger when the guy calls you, he has a better defined need. Whereas in an outbound call, you have to develop, is there a real need? Is this the right guy? And all of that. But eventually you get over that hump. And so then the rest of what we've talked about today more or less applies as if he called you. I would, being friendly, not being robotic, especially a lot of people that cold call me, they don't at all focus on what I'm interested in. They've got their script and what they need to say. So, actually having a conversation and being solution oriented is going to be better than just plowing through your script. Okay. So, cold calling is definitely harder. It's better when they call you. There's a demonstrated intent. But once you get over that intent part and you're in the qualification and the discussion and whatnot, everything that we've talked about today comes into play immediately.
Yeah, I agree, Brian. If I'm thinking in terms of engaging someone in an outbound environment, early part of the call, again, we're being polite, establishing, trying to bring down your target's defense, if you will, that inherently is in front of you. But the next piece is, hey, establish why you're calling, and get to the point quickly. Again, hopefully your effort in this process to solve a problem. You perceive this person has a problem. You haven't identified that yet. Let's establish that right up front.